This is Writer's Mosaic in Conversation. In 2022, the writer Hanif Kureishi, best known for his novel The Buddha of Suburbia, suffered a terrible accident which left him with paralysing spinal injuries. He has continued to write and has since published Shattered, a memoir about the experience. Chitra Ramaswamy talks to Ruvani Ranasinha, author of a recent biography of Kureishi, and the novelist Mohammed Hanif about Kureishi's extraordinary writing and career.
Welcome to What I Predict. Considering Hanif Kureishi is the subject, is going to be an illuminating, lively, complex, tender, and certainly naughty conversation. My name's Chitra Ramaswamy. I'm an author and journalist, and I'll briefly introduce our esteemed panel, and then we're going to get going. Ruvani Ranasinha is Professor of Global Literature at King's College London, specialising in post-colonial literature, and she's the author of the first and indeed the definitive biography of Hanif Kureishi, Writing the Self, which has been described as magnificent, meticulous, and exhaustive. To which I would add that it's also an incredibly nuanced, fair, and considered assessment of the man, the work, and the times. Mohammed Hanif is a British Pakistani writer and journalist, now based in Karachi, and the author of novels including A Case of Exploding Mangoes, which was longlisted for the Booker Prize and won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Best First Novel. So I thought it would be appropriate to begin with the personal impact Hanif Kureishi has had on each of us as writers, but specifically as South Asian writers, because I think he, certainly for me, is one of those rare writers where I can actually pinpoint the moment in my life where I first read his words. That's how explosive his impact has been, certainly on me. Ruvani, would you like to begin?
So I actually came across his work first, the film, on TV, My Beautiful Laundrette, when I was a late teen. I just came across it late one night. And I think retrospectively, I realized the impact it had on me rather than at the time. But I just immediately sensed there was something very subversive about the sort of defiance of his sort of British-born second-generation characters who I could relate to. It struck a chord. I mean, they were caring and they were dutiful, but they were also pursuing their forbidden loves and their kind of dreams, and I felt that there was something about this character, this guy and his work that just gripped me really. Yeah.
Yes, it's so powerful, that moment where we meet Kureishi's work. In your biography, you actually close with the lines, "What he achieved for himself and what he did for us." Could you speak a little bit more about that sense of what he did for us?
I think it is somebody who really stood up for people of color with his kind of outspoken, that kind of defiant refusal to accept racism of any form, not casual racism, not banter, and that. So as in his writing, but also I think in his quite provocative public persona, he really, I think, had a big impact on me and many others. I mean, there were people I interviewed who said that when they would go on the street with him, people would stop Hanif and say, thank you for what you said about racial slurs, about what you, how you, made something that was sort of considered kind of acceptable, and shown how it wasn't, that kind of the violation of self, what racism did.
Absolutely. Hanif, what about you? You're actually quoted in Ruvini's biography a few times. And as both a playwright and a novelist yourself, it would be wonderful to hear about Kureishi's impact on you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for quoting me in your brilliant book. I came across his work when I was starting out as a journalist in Karachi. So obviously this film that had gone on to the Oscars, so that's why it kind of became famous. Oscar-nominated film, Hanif Kureishi. Okay, what's this about? So we watched this film and it was like a freak show because I did not have any contacts. I, of course, did have gay friends in Karachi, but obviously they never talked about their kind of sexuality, their issues. So that was a bit of a shock. And then I was starting out as a journalist and, sort of journalism is usually compartmentalized, like, sort of you're a political reporter, you do the crime beat and you do literature. And then I came across this piece that he'd written in Granta. It's called Wild Women and Wild Men. It's about these two Muslim girl performers who were kind of, performing in these kind of hideous places in London. And that was quite an eye-opener. Oh, you can report like this. You can, look at people like this. You can evoke kind of these kind of reactions. So I think that was quite an eye-opener. And then obviously kind of we looked for what else he had done. And obviously we came across Buddha of Suburbia. I think there's people of my generation from South Asia who kind of dabble into kind of writing or literature or fiction, especially. I mean, many of them I've heard. There are a lot of them are Rushdie tragics. They would say that, oh, we read like Midnight Children. It just opened my eyes. For me, it has always been Hanif Kureishi. And I think there's another reason, because Hanif in Pakistan is a very, very uncool name. I do not know a single poet or a writer who's called Hanif. So when I read his writing, I said, this guy kind of Hanif, and he's doing pretty well. He writes pretty well. I like his writing. So kind of that gave me permission that that's fine. I could try and do this.
I love that the permission was so specifically related to you at the level of sharing a name as much as anything else.
Only cricket tragics would appreciate that there was a Pakistani cricketer called Hanif at some point, sort of like, but otherwise, like, I've never heard of like a Hanif who's a poet or a writer or like, sort of who wrote anything good ever. So.
Seeing as you've mentioned Wild Women, Wild Men there, which I had never heard of before I read Ruvini's biography. Would you read a little from it for us?
Yeah, I'll just read a bit from the beginning. When I saw them waiting beside their car, I said, "You must be freezing." It was cold and foggy, the first night of winter, and the two women had matching short skirts and skimpy tops. Their legs were bare. "We wear what we like," Zarina said. Zarina was the elder of the pair. At 24, for her, this wasn't a job. It was an uprising, mutiny. She was the one with the talent for anarchy and unpredictability that made their show so wild. Qamar was 19 and seemed more tired and weary. The work could disgust her, and unlike Zarina, she did not enjoy the opportunity for mischief and disruption. Qamar had run away from home. Her father was a barrister and worked as a stripper on the Soho circuit, pretending to be Spanish. Zarina had worked as a kissogram. Neither had made much money until they identified themselves as Pakistani Muslims who stripped and did a lesbian double act. They had discovered a talent and an audience for it. The atmosphere was febrile and overwrought. The two women's behavior was a cross between pop stars and fugitives. They were excited by the notoriety, the money, and the danger of what they did. They had been written up in the sports and the news of the world. They wanted me and others to write about them. But everything could get out of hand. The danger was real. It gave their lives an edge. But of the two of them, only Qamar knew they were doomed. They had excluded themselves from their community and been condemned. And they hadn't found a safe place among other men and women. Zarina's temperament wouldn't allow her to accept this, though she appeared to be the more nervous. Qamar just knew it would end badly, but didn't know how to stop it. Perhaps because Zarina didn't want it to stop, and Qamar was, I think, in love with Zarina.
Thank you, Hanif. I can see as a young journalist how reading those words would have whacked you about the chops. As for me, the personal impact, I mentioned I can pinpoint the moment where I first read Qureshi, and I was, I think, a pre-teenager, and the Buddha of Suburbia had come out, and actually it was the cover of that book. I had never seen a book cover for a start that had somebody who, looked like someone who could be my dad on it. But also it was reframed in this kind of Beatles cover-esque pop art collage. It was so cool. It was so British. It was so Asian. I'd never seen this particular kind of combination of things on a book cover before. And it almost felt like as much of a cultural artifact as a book, really. And then, of course, I read those opening lines and I just was actually beside myself with excitement. I was growing up in Southwest London. We had some things in common, but in other ways we were worlds apart. You know, South London and Southwest London, they sound close, but they're very different. And our classes were very different. I'm the daughter of middle class Hindus from Bangalore. And I grew up in a very white middle class environment where race was not spoken of. So I think the character of Eva, in particular, in the Buddha of Suburbia, spoke so directly to my own experience that I had never articulated to myself. And here was a writer who was writing about such kind of difficult and taboo subjects as racism. You know, I was very much growing up in that kind of you know, we don't see color kind of environment. So the gaslighting was going on in such a kind of national scale that this book just kind of broke through all of that with such irreverence and lightness of touch. And, you know, for my age as well, so utterly full of sex. It completely blew the doors of my mind open and suggested that things were possible that I had never imagined could be possible. I would say it's probably one of three books that, you know, I could genuinely say sort of changed my life, that I was one person on one side of it and another when I closed the book. Do either of you want to add anything in particular to where Buddha of Suburbia sits in the canon of kind of English comic novels? Ruvini, it would be wonderful to hear you on this because it is widely considered to be Qureshi's masterpiece, isn't it?
I mean, I think it is. And I think he really invented a character that really hadn't been seen in English literature, kind of frizzy-haired, libidinous, you know, with this sort of complicated mix of culture and class and generation. And it is in a portrait of the 70s, but all the things that were bubbling up and things that weren't really being talked about. I think the range of racism, you know, not just kind of in your face racism, but more subtle, the portrait of theatre land, but also of, you know, a coming of age, you know, novel. So it was so many things, I think. Yeah.
What about you, Hanif?
Yeah, I read it in Karachi, and again, I did not have the context. But after I moved here, in fact, I recently reread it because I live in the place where it is set in, like in South London, like, you know, sort of between Bromley and Honor Oak Park, and it made like so much more sense to me now. I have a child who goes to school and things have kind of moved on, you can say, like because my 10-year-old is on a diversity committee, and I find like all those things kind of reading that very funny, and there's like such a strong sense of place in the book, or maybe I live here so I can identify more. I kind of resent sometimes that why did he miss this park and why did he not mention this street, because you can see like the whole kind of, you know, whole place, and the very, very strong sense of class, which we all kind of, you know, sort of have, but we don't really know how to articulate it, except for like, you know, sort of in most prosaic terms. So I still find it that rereading it, I had a lot more fun because now kind of I can see those places that are mentioned in the book.
That's fascinating. I also reread it recently and was blown away by how much more it was about class than I had previously thought. I think I had been so blindsided by his sort of micro assessments of the different gradations of racism that I had kind of missed all the sensitivities around class, which are just so brilliant and beautifully observed and still so true. Actually, it still stands, and it's absolutely brilliant on all of these these things that we now have so much language for, like ideas around white fragility, and it's all in there. It's all in there. We talk about Qureshi as being a kind of prophet or a seer, and his writing is so prescient, but we're usually talking about that in political terms. But I also thought in cultural terms, he really could see where a lot of the discussions have gone, and he was saying things that we're only now finding language for. I'll read a little from the start of Buddha of Suburbia. I think it's one of the best openings. I think it rivals, speaking of the comparison with Rushdie, I think it rivals the opening of Midnight's Children, and actually is very similar. It's that hark back to Dickens, isn't it? But then that kind of also throwing Dickens out of the room. My name is Karim Amir, and I am an Englishman, born and bred, almost. I am often considered to be a funny kind of Englishman, a new breed, as it were, having emerged from two old histories. But I don't care. Englishman I am, though not proud of it, from the South London suburbs and going somewhere. Perhaps it's the odd mixture of continents and blood, of here and there, of belonging and not, that makes me restless and easily bored. Or perhaps it was being brought up in the suburbs that did it. Anyway, why search the inner room when it's enough to say that I was looking for trouble, any kind of movement, action, and sexual interest I could find, because things were so gloomy, so slow and heavy in our family. I don't know why. Quite frankly, it was all getting me down, and I was ready for anything. Then one day, everything changed. In the morning, things were one way, and by bedtime, another. I was 17. On this day, my father hurried home from work, not in a gloomy mood. His mood was high for him. I could smell the train on him as he put his briefcase away behind the front door and took off his raincoat, chucking it over the bottom of the banisters. He grabbed my fleeing little brother, Ali, and kissed him. He kissed my mother and me with enthusiasm, as if we'd recently been rescued from an earthquake. More normally, he handed Mum his supper, a packet of kebabs and chapatis so greasy their paper wrapper had disintegrated. Next, instead of flopping into a chair to watch the television news and wait for Mum to put the warmed-up food on the table, he went into their bedroom, which was downstairs next to the living room. He quickly stripped to his vest and underpants. "Fetch the pink towel," he said to me. I did so. Dad spread it on the bedroom floor and fell onto his knees. I wondered if he'd suddenly taken up religion, but no. He placed his arms beside his head and kicked himself into the air. "I must practice," he said in a stifled voice. "Practice for what?" I said reasonably, watching him with interest and suspicion. "They've called me for the damn yoga Olympics," he said. He easily became sarcastic, Dad. He was standing on his head now, balanced perfectly. His stomach sagged down, his balls and prick fell forward in his pants. The considerable muscles in his arms swelled up, and he breathed energetically. Like many Indians, he was small, but Dad was also elegant and handsome, with delicate hands and manners. Beside him, most Englishmen looked like clumsy giraffes. He was broad and strong, too. When young, he'd been a boxer and fanatical chest expander. He was as proud of his chest as our next-door neighbours were of their kitchen range. As the sun's first smile, he would pull off his shirt and stride out into the garden with a deck chair and a copy of the New Statesman. He told me that in India he shaved his chest regularly so its hair would sprout more luxuriantly in years to come. I reckoned that his chest was the one area in which he had been forward-thinking. It's just it's such a pleasure to read because it's so funny.
Yes, it is very funny, and I've sort of recently started yoga, so whenever I'm in a yoga class, and sometimes lovely yoga teachers, they use that kind of language, so there's that voice, that kind of this scene comes to my mind always.
Absolutely.
And in a sense, everything is there. It's class, it's generation, but it's also gender, handing over the mother the food and the different roles in the family. And I do think that was what was incredible, that we realized in novels, we can't just think about race on its own. It is also about class. It is, and I think that was the other character. I mean, I know it is Karim's novel, of course, but for me, that it was sort of Jamila. I just remained irresistibly drawn to this sort of feisty, outspoken feminist. I thought there wasn't a character like her either, for British Asians. And I think that made a huge impact on many people.
She is an astonishing character, Jamila. I completely agree. And I think she's a wonderful counter to the people who have gone on over years to sort of see Hanif Kureishi as a writer who is not kind of fair on women, or who doesn't write women well, because she is a brilliantly three-dimensional, very fierce woman. What would you say to those people who, I suppose, particularly after Intimacy, Hanif Kureishi was considered by many to be, a misogynist writer, a writer who could be very vicious and cruel about women, or, at best did not write women well. How did you feel about that before you wrote the biography, and how do you feel about that now?
I mean, I felt, very keen to do a kind of feminist reading of Hanif, I think, as a writer and as a man, and I was determined not to sort of let him off the hook, in that sense. But I also do feel that he has, his achievements in creating characters like Jamila haven't really been accounted for. I mean, and it was an earlier a female character in his first play called Borderline, a British Asian girl, and the first scene opens with her kind of negotiating sex with her boyfriend. I mean, in that opening scene, it just decimated so many sort of stereotypes, and even sort of the Daily Telegraph and Times, white feminist reviewers were like, oh, it's so interesting to see like brown women having sex. It was just extraordinary. So I think in that sense, he really did shift things in that way. And I think that there are questions with Hanif's work about women. I think in some ways they are he sort of has sometimes there's not the same depth with some of his male characters. Sometimes the women are catalysts to the wider stories, but when he does engage and invest in the female characters, I think that they're extraordinary. And I think, just to touch on the Intimacy question, I think people just did read it as a kind of self-portrait, and I think what he is looking at is flawed men and the sort of the alienating parts of men and masculinity, and I think he's dramatizing that. Of course, some of it is rooted in personal life, but I think he was very keen to sort of mark a different aspect of his career, and he was sort of reinventing himself as a writer. He wanted to move away from social satire and sort of class and race, and he wanted to look at the kind of the private, unpalatable forms of masculinity. And so that's, I think, what he's doing. It's not a manifesto for hating women at all. I don't think. I think he has rich and important relationships with women who have really influenced him.
That's really interesting. And I agree, actually, particularly having read your biography, that Intimacy in many ways is more interested in a kind of pretty excoriating excavation of the male psyche. It's more interested in examining that than it is a sort of diatribe against women in any way. He's also, of course, absolutely brilliant, and I think his most kind of tender work is when he's examining the relationship between fathers and sons. And I know, Hanif, that's been a huge influence on you, and you spoke about that very beautifully in Ruvani's book. Could you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I've read him first about Intimacy, and it was made like really cringy kind of read. Anybody who read it, I was in Karachi, remember reading it. I didn't know about the wider kind of controversy that was going on here. and I think that my friends who read it could see a bit of themselves uh, in it, and that's why they hated it. And I think this was like one of those rare books which kind of divided a room kind of in the middle. I have not heard such fierce debates about a book, at least in Karachi, about like a slim little novel, kind of, which kind of just makes people kind of, want to punch each other. So I was quite fascinated by that. What is this power where you can, sort of draw out such emotions? And through his work, I've always been fascinated that I think kind of brings kind of family to the center. And although kind of, we live like in a Western world where we keep saying like, as Asians, like, sort of families become this kind of, loose, meaningless kind of thing, but it hasn't. So he kind of keeps going back to his father, sort of famously that we all know. And then increasingly, like, after I think he's had his boys, then a lot of his short stories are just like, sort of there's this one particular short story that I remember where this football just gets stuck in the tree. And there's like, sort of they're trying to get it down. And this is my personal take. This is not like any big literary theory, but from what I've read and from what I've seen, that from outside to us, like who've spent most of their lives in South Asia and kind of, and he's like, sort of lives like the life of a sort of a Gora man, has those kind of sensibilities. But when it comes to family, he comes across as like one of those very middle class desi uncles who want his sons to do well, who has like a, sort of a padda and admiration with his dad, and and won't let go, will keep kind of exploring it to an extent where we kind of mostly don't. And I think in Desi families, in South Asian families, like, your first rebellion is always against your parents. And in a way, I think he kind of, went through that phase, and then kind of he's done that whole circle. And now I kind of look at him as like, sort of one of those like Desi parents who kind of, completely focus on making their boys, in his case, like, sort of good, hardworking, productive, successful men. I think that's how I feel about his kind of the way he kind of depicts his family and his kind of children, or like even fictional families that he does. So that seems to be kind of a recurring kind of theme in his writings.
Ruvani, would you agree with that? I think that's so interesting to see those two sort of sides of Qureshi in that way. I think in some ways why I identified with him and his characters so closely is interestingly because of his mixed race experience. So the ways in which he felt very estranged from his Pakistani heritage, and he didn't speak the language, and he had these uncles and the family there, but when he saw them, he couldn't understand the language they were speaking, and he felt alienated when he went to Pakistan, and of course he felt alienated in Bromley too. And I grew up very much in that position, and so it was almost I had the only South Asian representation I had was, the families in, around me in Southall or Hounslow, that it was a community and they were together. And he just seemed so apart from all of that and living this very, very singular life. And I think that's what spoke so strongly and deeply to me.
I mean, I thought that too before I sort of did the book. In a sense, he does seem, very, very English in many ways. And he grew up, mostly with his white mom, and she was a big influence. He didn't have that Hounslow, Southall community. He didn't grow up with that. But then I realized, what an influence his uncles who used to visit from Karachi every year, and what his father, was so important to him. And And I think he was very drawn to those sort of models of masculinity, those kind of very confident, outspoken uncles. They politicized him. I think Omar Qureshi, very esteemed journalist, it was really him that gave him a kind of defamiliarizing view of Britain when he went to Karachi before he wrote My Beautiful Laundrette. And I think that was, it was the first time. I think he was in his late 20s, so it's quite late to really go. But I think that really hasn't been explored, the effect of that visit to Karachi and meeting the family. And I think he was a very, white, very British in many ways. But I do think in terms of his family dynamics, he does sort of revert to that sort of the Asian model, absolutely. And even he's got a very sort of intense, very loving relationship with his sons, and they drop in at all hours. And I just remember when I used to visit to write the book, I used to think, gosh, this is a very South Asian sort of familiarity, in that way. But yeah, so I think there's more South Asian cultural hinterlands than you would imagine. And I think also, as I said, the kind of the white British reception of him has tended to focus on Bromley, on Bowie, and and those are important contexts. But I think what I did want to bring to the fore was the importance of the South. I think you can't understand Qureishi's work without understanding his father, that immigrant legacy, the whole, what those uncles and what they represented. I think you need to, it's such an important part of Qureishi's life and work.
Absolutely. And you really do give rightful prominence to that in your book. Hanif, could you talk a little bit about how Qureshi has been received in Pakistan and in Karachi, where you're now based, over time, how that's changed over time?
I think people sort of take pride in the fact that, somebody called Hanif Kureishi, it's like very common, sort of unliterary Pakistani name, has done so well in the West, and is. But I think when they sort of interact with him, he's been there a few times. I was there like at least a couple of times, and people kind of are very hospitable and kind of treat him like a sort of the celebrity that he is, and then they expect something in return. They want him to say something nice about them, basically. And he does not do that. So then they are aghast at what kind of sort of rude behavior is this. So the high society in Karachi, at least, kind of aspire to kind of mingle with him, or or his natural kind of playground. I think in the end, after having interacted with him, they are kind of sort of quite disappointed, because I think I was there when he was talking at one of the festivals, and somebody kind of sort of this very posh lady kind of stood up and say, like, what do you think of Karachi? And he said it's like a dirty, old, filthy city, which I've lived there, which it is. You don't want to hear it from an outsider. So he's, I think he does, which he always does, that he kind of, speaks his mind, then which people don't like. But I was also quite surprised that after his first experience, when he went there and kind of, before writing My Beautiful Laundrette, he wrote a story set in Karachi back then also, which was also one of my earlier readings, where I could identify the characters, like the fat publisher, like, sort of the gay reporter, the kind of, sort of the, so that was also a revelation that you could write about society, like, sort of without caring, like, sort of who will say what. So he has that kind of attitude towards writing. So people, I think younger generation, probably because they're kind of sitting in their homes, they're kind of more cosmopolitan, they understand the context more, they get the pop preferences more. So I think they're probably more understanding, but people of kind of my generation, older people who've read him and kind of, aspire to be in the same room that he is, I think they in the end are a bit disappointed that because he does not waste any time like trying to charm people or kind of, yeah, I think that's
I think that there is something about his legacy being just an absolute and often bracing truth telling, isn't it? So of course that annoys people on all sides, and that's the nature of it. But it's also one of the reasons why he's such a powerful storyteller, because he will say things that many others won't, and he's been like that from the outset. Ruvini, I think I really got a sense of that from the biography when you sort of return to his formative years, and at the Royal Court and Riverside Studios, and perhaps we could go back there, and you could talk a little bit about his formation as a writer and who kind of contributed to that. It's a fascinating story, and then it would be wonderful if you would read a little for us as well.
Of course. I think, what I found really interesting about, writing this book is that how many people supported, this writing journey. And I think, and I talk about, if it takes a village to raise a child, it really was that for Kureishi. I think it was his father, of course, his first model, as a writer himself, his discipline, and it was his father who gave him the idea. But then he saw his father as sort of an unsuccessful person because he wasn't published in that way. So he was also a model not to be. So I think that was important. His uncles, as I've suggested, he came from a very literary, talented family. So that, in a way, he came from a family of writers, and that offset the quite difficult childhood and difficult education he had, because he saw at least that it's possible, to be a writer. I think for his I think the earliest, mentor he had was this publisher. When he was 15, he wrote this book. It's extraordinary. And he sent it to this publisher. And Jeremy Trafford was the person who landed on his desk. And it's just an extraordinary thing that Jeremy Trafford, they didn't publish the book. It was very raw and unpublishable, but they felt it was extraordinary if, someone so young had written, something so powerful. And he, would come and visit, the Kureishi family and edit his work painstakingly. And Kureishi says, he talked to him about character, and that still stays with him. So I think he really made a huge difference from just writing his own stuff and never getting published. But and I think, so it's individuals like that, but also in a way liberal institutions. And I often thought when I was writing the book, could there be a Hanif Kureishi now? I mean, it's a thing about public funding and so many things. I mean, he, the Riverside Studios, it gave him such a kind of exposure to different kinds of artists, and they took on his stuff. They did publish, and they performed his early plays, and it gave him a kind of a sense of folly. But of course, the Royal Court. I mean, that's really, I think, where he kind of found his writing voice, the politics of the British Asian, families that he explored in that early play, but also that kind of dissenting Englishness. And he felt, well, this is my tradition. So I think these different, in a way, so I structured the biography in terms of people and places, in a sense, because these different places had such an important, impact on him. These sort of liberal institutions who really did, and it's a kind of an irony of his career, because of course he was provoked into writing because of racism, but at the same time, these liberal institutions were ready to hear his voice, and they felt he had something important to say, and they did support him. So I would say, Max Stafford Clark, so many people, and even, his early publishers at Faber, Robert McCrum, his first partner, Tracy Scofield. Without them, I think, they really did help him with the editing and all the work it takes to become a good writer.
Absolutely. That's a powerful point, posing the question as to whether Hanif Kureishi could exist now in this risk-averse moment in time. Yeah, interesting. Ruvini, would you read for us now? You're going to read from The Rainbow Sign, which I suspect many people will not know. So if you could tell us a little bit about the work as well, and why you chose it.
So The Rainbow Sign was Kureishi's first published essay in 1985, and it was about 80s Britain, but it was also in the middle, a sort of a sandwich section of this first visit to Pakistan. But I think it's his most compelling sort of indictment about race and racism in Britain, but also through his sort of unique perspective. So I'll just read a little bit from the beginning and then also from the end, because I think, this is what really Kureishi brought to the fore. I mean, there were people like Rushdie had written about India and intermingling and mixing, but there was no one who had spoken I think, about what it was like to be British, to be born here, and yet feel, an outsider. I was born in London of an English mother and a Pakistani father. My father, who lives in London, came to England from Mumbai in 1947 to be educated by the old colonial power. He married here and never went back to India. The rest of his large family, his brothers and their wives and his sisters, moved from Bombay to Karachi in Pakistan after partition. Frequently during my childhood, I met my Pakistani uncles when they came to London on business. They were important, confident people who took me to hotels, restaurants, and test matches, often in taxis. But I had no idea what the subcontinent was like or how my numerous uncles and aunts and cousins lived there. When I was 9 or 10, a teacher purposefully placed some pictures of Indian peasants in mud huts in front of me and said to the class, "Hanif comes from India." And I wondered, did my uncles ride on camels? Surely not in their suits. Did my cousins, so much like me in other ways, squat down in the sand like little Mowglis, half naked, eating with their fingers? From the start, I had tried to deny my Pakistani self. I was ashamed. It was a curse, and I wanted to be rid of it. So he goes on about his life at school, but I want to talk a little bit more about the kind of the political statement that he builds up towards in this essay. And it links to what we were saying about him being outspoken and saying things, because I think there was, when he came to the fore, there wasn't an acceptance and an acknowledgement of the racism that was being felt. And he writes, tolerant, gentle British whites have no idea how little of the tolerance Britain's famous for is experienced by Blacks here. No idea of the violence, hostility, and contempt directed against Black people every day by the state and the individual alike. And in the meantime, it must be made clear that Blacks don't require tolerance in this particular condescending way. It isn't this particular paternal tyranny that is wanted, since it is major adjustments to British society that have to be made. I stress that it is the British who have to make these adjustments. It is the British, the white British, who have to learn that being British isn't what it was. Now it is a more complex thing involving new elements. So there must be a fresh way of seeing Britain and the choices it faces, and a new way of being British after all this time. Much thought, discussion, and self-examination must go into seeing the necessity for this, what this new way of being British involves, and how difficult it might be to attain. The failure to grasp this opportunity for a revitalized and broader self-definition in the face of a real failure to be human will be more insularity, schism, bitterness, and catastrophe. The two countries, Britain and Pakistan, have been part of each other for years, usually to the advantage of Britain. They cannot now be wrenched apart, even if that were desirable. Their futures will be intermixed. What that intermix means, its moral quality, whether it is violently resisted by ignorant whites and characterized by inequality and injustice, or understood, accepted, and humanized, is for all of us to decide. This decision is not one about a small group of irrelevant people who can be contemptuously described as minorities. It is about the direction of British society, about its values and how humane it can be when experiencing real difficulty and possible breakdown. It is about the respect it accords individuals, the power it gives to groups, and what it really means when it describes itself as democratic. The future is in our hands.
It's really powerful stuff, isn't it? And I mean, extraordinary that was his first essay and he was writing that in the 1980s.
85. And, no one was talking about this. I mean, it was assimilation. You had to humbly and gratefully assimilate. That was the buzzword. So I think that was so extraordinary.
Absolutely. And that sense of the word that I grew up with was tolerance, and that was the best that we could expect, and there he is the decade before, absolutely blowing that out of the water and saying we are not asking for that. Yeah, it's so powerful. I feel it's time really to turn. We could talk about so many different aspects of Hanif Kureishi's work here, be here for hours, but it feels important at this time to turn now to the terrible accident that happened on Boxing Day a couple of years ago. Was it? It was 2022, is that right? Yes. And in your book, Ruvani, you actually had written the book before this happened, so you then included a kind of an afterward in which you mention it. But it has proved to be obviously a seismic event in his life and a terrible thing to happen. It's also been a huge catalyst in terms of writing, and he has produced so much writing. Considering he is paralyzed from the neck down. I believe that's still the case, although you can keep us right as to whether what his latest improvements are. I mean, it's an astonishing story of fortitude and resolve.
I mean, absolutely. And I mean, I hadn't written the whole thing, so I had,
Okay.
you know, I was able to talk about what happened in some detail. And I really wanted to not change anything or sort of soften the criticism of him. I wanted, you know, to still write the book that I had written. And then, of course, he writes, in a way, he takes the story from there with this extraordinary memoir. But I do remember, you know, in those dark days, it was just a devastating thing for his family, of course, and for him. But this thinking and writing to him saying, if anyone can get through this, it's you, because in a way, this is what he has done in his own life when he turned the trauma of racism into, you know, comedic gold, into fiction, and he has such prodigious mental strength. And I think that's what I think my book does show, that, you know, how he, you know, he withstood, you know, awful racism at school and real brutality, being betrayed by his peers. I don't know, you know, this is different, but in a sense, I feel that he is still showing that incredible, strength. And I think it's also, being a writer is so important to him. You know, it is so much part of his identity that he, and his sense of self. And I think this is really what is keeping him going, you know, in many ways. And I think it's the same qualities, the honesty. You know, it's not a kind of sanitized, feel good at all narrative. It's the opposite. It's the brutal reality of what it is like to wake up and have your life change, to be dependent, how it affects your relationships. So I mean, I think you know, it's a miraculous book, and I think it is extraordinary. It's an extraordinary achievement.
Absolutely. That's the sense that I got from Shattered, is a man who is writing to survive and to stay alive, which to some extent your wonderful biography demonstrates has been his impulse from the absolute outset, from those first diary entries where he said, you know, with absolute confidence, I'm going to get out of Bromley and I'm going to be a writer. And now, you know, with Shattered, there's a through line, isn't there? Hanif, what was it like for you when you saw, I'm sure you were amongst, you know, the many people, I was one of them too, who was following those early Substack posts from the hospital in Rome, where I believe Kureishi was dictating to his partner Isabella, and she was writing them on her phone, and then they were publishing immediately on Substack. Were you following the story at that point?
Yes, I was, and I was shocked. And then some of it was very funny, so I was like very proud of him as well, that he hasn't lost his sense of humor. And I think you said all that there is to be said. But I found this again very fascinating, that in this whole kind of, you know, crisis, he also roped his son into being his collaborator. So it's like that very kind of, you know, sort of wise guy family type thing, where you kind of, you know, put your sons to work to help you to kind of, you know, make something of themselves as well. So with that, I found very fascinating. And you talked about honesty and and bravery, and I don't think writers should have to be brave or but I think honestly, like, people write about, like, you know, sort of their misery and their love lives and their families. But I think I haven't seen any writer who writes about their own greed. For example, remember there was this, he was a victim of this financial fraud, so he wrote this little book called My Thief, I think it was called. So I haven't seen I haven't come across any contemporary writer who kind of go out and talk about their own greed, which I always thought was very, very very brave, and he has yes, I mean, there's the will to write, as he kind of, as it says right in the beginning of your biography, where he actually addresses his biographer, no, his future biographer. Yes, leaves a note.
That's confidence.
Like where do you find a subject like that, where somebody's been making notes since they were teenagers? So yeah, it's very it's kind of, it's a very, very fascinating story, that somebody who's kind of always been wanting to be a writer, wants to be a writer more than ever at this stage in their lives, and is writing kind of brilliant stuff.
Absolutely. And to close, I think it would be wonderful to hear from both of you as to what you think Hanif Kureishi's legacy is as a British Asian writer. And Ruvani, particularly you, whether your assessment of him and his importance and his kind of position in the firmament of writers has changed, because you do get a sense reading your book, and also just from what we know from following Hanif Kureishi over the decades, that while he has been rightfully feted, in some ways he's been kind of underrated at the same time. So it would be great to hear you on that.
I mean, I think, he'll be known as always as a writer who redefined Englishness, to redefine what it is to be British. I think, that is huge. But I think, he is like a literary godfather, yes, to so much British Asian culture, but I think so much more. And I think there is a way in which he was slightly taken for granted. I mean, I was sort of tracking his reception in the book, and there's curiously lots of carping. And in a way, I think he's become such a sort of British institution. And it was quite astounding to me, like after this accident happened, how it was really then that a lot of people who have been quite critical before, like, came out and sort of praised him so much. So it was a bit awful. It was a bit like when after Martin Amis died, there was all these great, sort of accounts of him. So I feel I feel in some ways, yes, his, within certain circles, his achievement has been recognized, but also not what a catalyst he was for other creatives. Like, he brought so many people, like, it wasn't so much mentoring, but like, he brought forth many writers and directors their first breakthrough work as well. So I think he's been so important, sort of, culturally. But I think it's his voice, isn't it? I mean, we didn't get a chance to talk about that, but I think that sort of bold, engaging, irreverent, I think that is what his legacy really is, that playfulness, but also the sarcasm, even in the bits that I read, somebody talking about race in a sarcastic way. It is the preserve of equals. And that was what was so extraordinary about him, that it wasn't deferential, but it was, registering these important shifts, but always doing it through comedy, or through different ways.
Yeah. For me, I will go with just his kind of unyielding commitment to truth, and to speaking about subjects that no one else was speaking about. And as you say, in that very particular voice. I mean, the power that he invested in all of us when he made jokes out of racism. In other words, he refused to wear the shame as his own. And I found that so powerful. And it was kind of permission giving, wasn't it? There was a permission he gave us in that. Hanif.
Yes, I think his voice sort of, given these, like, cycles of commercial success, or kind of, sort of being ignored or being underrated, those will come and go. But I think his voice will kind of survive all these cycles, and readers, I think, will always connect with him, especially readers who want to be writers. They kind of get a lot from him. And I also have I'm a personal beneficiary of his legacy, because quite often I get mistaken for him. So, so it feels really nice. I was my wife is an actor, and I was at a film party recently, and a young, handsome producer came and hugged me and thanked me for writing my beautiful laundry. And somebody
Brilliant.
even recently had some who said, "Oh, that's been a
And did you correct him?
miraculous recovery." I sort of let it linger for a while before
Quite right.
because I have to admit it does feel nice. It feels really nice.
Can I just add, I think also he's been a liberating person to so many writers as well. That's a lot of the younger writers I spoke to, and his peers, that he would say, like, just be honest, say what you think, and I think his boldness is so important. Now, I mean, we were speaking about his relevance. I think this time of kind of cancel culture and content warnings and all the self-censorship, I think his boldness in speaking out, I think that is also very, very important. And he's not just saying the same thing over again. I mean, I think he is a chronicler of our times. I mean, yes, he was produced by the 80s and Thatcherite era, which he kicked against. But I think he is a very astute kind of chronicler of shifting politics. And the section that I just read, it was the white British who must change. He talks about that was written in the mid 80s. But more recently, in an interview with Simon Sharma, he talks about the importance of mutual compromise, and he says things like, when there are extremes, multiculturalism dies. And I thought that was such an interesting kind of trajectory. I think he's saying, he's very astute, I think, and remains so relevant to us.
You're so absolutely right. I think he has been actually one man liberation army for like aspiring writers and artists, like, in different parts of the world who kind of, have kind of seeked kind of, okay, if we can do this, maybe we can try and give it a go.
A one-man liberation army, and I think that's a wonderful place to finish, and with his boldness as well. Thank you so much to both of you for this enlightening and appreciating conversation about Hanif Kureishi.
Chitra Ramaswamy was talking with Ruvani Ranasinha and Mohammed Hanif. To hear more writers, go to writersmosaic.org.uk.